kind of take 2 minutes to summarize. I'm going to try to do this every class because that's how important it is. We have to remember that a lot of what I'm trying to teach you guys is reprogramming your mind to see these things the way they are and not how we've been taught to see them through activities of daily life. It's nobody's fault. We use our muscles to do everything that we do, activities of daily living, work, exercise. So it makes sense that our close friends, family, coaches are going to use verbiage that fits what they do. It's just that a lot of times this verbiage is just fast and loose, as we call it, where it's incomplete, it's not correct, it's not their fault, they don't know any better, okay? So it is tough. It's almost like in some of our previous courses, how it's tough to not say this is the shoulder going up and down, right? Examples like that. Flex your muscles. Right? Joints flex, muscles contract. Little things like that that we have to recondition our brain to see for what it is, not what we always heard it is. So muscles can only pull, that's it. They influence motion through tension or pull force. They can't push and pull. Bones can push, but the reason bones can push is because muscles are pulling on them. I have this very expensive prop to explain what the heck I'm talking about. If I want to influence this cart, yes, I can push it with my hand, but that's only because muscles are pulling on the bones that are thus pushing on the cart. If this was more of an analogy of how muscles work by pulling, there's only one way in the direction that I'm pulling that I can influence this cart, and that is in the direction of my pull. I can't push the cart to your left. Now that being said, this is where things get a little weird, but it's okay. I'm hoping this analogy is going to make sense so you go, okay, I get it. In a joint such as like the elbow, I'm going to have muscles that influence or pull in both directions of motion. So for this analogy to really make sense, I have to have one set of strings or muscles pulling to your right, but I also have to have another set of strings or muscles pulling to your left. One group one way, one group the other way. Now watch the limitations of any one group, okay? The only way this muscle can influence motion is through pulling. So if the cart is not moving, I can make the cart come to me while pulling to me. But once it's coming to me, I can't push it to a stop with the same strength. I can't stop it while it's moving in the direction of my pull. So in other words, it would, right? I can't do it. Now, friction from the floor slows it down, but that's not my string pulling. If the cart was moving away from me, I could influence its motion moving away from me, but only by slowing it down. So in other words, the cart moves away from me, I can pull it to a stop, and then change its direction and make it come to me. Guys, that's what we call a plyometric sequence. And that's why plyometrics is only when a group of muscles is being lengthened, slowing down motion, putting on the brake, changing the direction, and then speeding up motion, going in the direction of pull. So the muscle did two different functions, or two different things, while pulling in the exact same direction. It slowed you down while it was going away from you, changed your direction, and then sped you up while coming to you. Now, once it speeds you up coming to you, there's really nothing else it can do. It can't push you to a stop. So once it has motion to you, you got to hope something else is going to slow you down. Okay? So I wanted to get that out there, that muscles can only pull, and because they can only pull, they are limited in how they can influence motion. If I were to, let's see how I want to do if I were to ask, or someone were to ask, what does the biceps brachii do in the body? Our fast and quick response, in fact, I'll show you via Google, textbooks and Google, and they're going to use a term, or sometimes it's most of the time they'll use a term called action. As physicists, we don't technically like the term action because that infers movement. So like you think about a director going, lights, camera, and action, that means move. Ironically enough, Newton's third law, action, reaction, isn't a movement law at all, it's a force law. For every force, there's a counterforce, but that just kind of gets evolved into fast and loose layman's terms verbiage. And layman's terms okay, but for people who are truly learning this stuff, it sometimes get in the way of understanding, okay? So what you'll see is something like the action of. Now, what I like about this is function. For our class, we're going to use the word function. Some textbooks and some descriptions use function, which to me is a much better word to use because it doesn't insinuate motion. As I'm going to teach you, muscles get their jobs or get their function based on the direction of pull, and there may not be any motion involved at all. Right? Isometrics, there's no motion at all. So when you associate action, it makes your brain think, well, something's got to move. And as we're going to see in a lot of different examples, that muscles can still do a job, but they won't necessarily produce motion. Okay? So in this class, so that we're all on the same page, we are going to use the term function. Now here's the second problem with fast and loose verbiage. Books, study charts, diagrams, Google. It's a lot easier for them to say this muscle does this motion. It's clean, it's easy. You don't have to go into the context, you don't have to go into the weeds, you don't have to understand. It's a lot easier to say the bicep flexes the elbow, or the biceps involved in elbow flexion. Okay? Now, I'm not saying it can't be. I'm not saying it won't be. I'm only saying that out of 3 possible outcomes of muscles influencing motion, the biceps actually being responsible for elbow flexion is 1 out of those 3. It's batting 33%. 333. The biceps, and you know this already, the biceps can also be responsible for extension when you lower it down. And the biceps can be responsible for maintaining my elevator while I get off, isometric. So the problem here is that in your study tools that you've had when you've had to pass a certification test, when you've been in lower level classes, and I don't mean that lesser, I'm saying freshman, sophomore level classes, it's learn that the hamstrings flex the knee. And that's fine and dandy when it's through the context of concentric contraction. But you're going to see that I can have knee flexion and it's not even the hamstrings. I can have knee flexion because of the quads. I can have knee extension because of the hamstrings through eccentric contraction. So the key thing here is when we talk about muscles and we talk about motion, there has to be a third variable. There has to be a context there. And that context is contraction. We have to talk about how muscles influence motion through the context of muscle contraction. You cannot have just 2. If we do just have one in terms of like what do muscles do, we don't have to have the context of contraction if we're true to what those skeletal muscles are doing, and that is specifically pulling in directions of motion, not confirming any one given motion. So in other words, the biceps brachii is an elbow flexion puller or an elbow flexor, not inferring that it always flexes the elbow, but it is always going to pull that way. It always pulls in the direction of flexion, regardless of if it does flexion through concentric, prevents extension through isometric, or allows extension through eccentric. That son of a gun was always pulling in this direction of motion. I have a couple examples of what I'm trying to get to, of what I'm trying to get here, okay? So here's a book. A book has it's a uniaxial hinge, open, close. Those are the two motions. We know that we can open the book traditionally, small piece, move about the big piece, but I could also open the book with the big piece moving about the small piece. We've done that several times. It's the same motion, right? So if I have a muscle that is going to pull in the direction, let's say, of book close, it's a book closing puller, meaning that the muscle pulls in a direction of book close, whether it's moving the small part of the book to close or the big part of the book to close. It's pulling the same way. Does that make sense? Book close puller, book close puller. Okay? So the same exact concept could be applied in something like the shoulder, where I could have a muscle serving, don't know my own strength. Instead of book close puller, I have a horizontal adduction puller. And this muscle is going to pull this way, whether or not I'm moving the cover of the book or whether I'm moving the actual book. It pulls the same way in a direction of horizontal adduction. When that muscle is pulling, you've heard the term muscle memory. Guys, muscles don't have brains. They don't have memory. That you have motor programmings that could be pretty relative from your brain, but the muscle is only reacting to a response. You zap it and it pulls more. Ring the bell, it salivates. You zap it with electricity and it's going to pull. Okay? So what we have to remember is that in textbooks and resources, you're going to see a lot of verbiage like the hamstrings are muscles which extend the hip and flex the knee. You're going to have these absolute movements for these muscles. The biggest challenge that I'm going to teach you, or I'm trying to teach you about how muscles work is we cannot associate specific muscles with specific motion. I think that's the best, simplest way of saying it. We cannot do this without the context of contraction. So in other words, I would have no problem if it says the hamstrings are muscles which extend the hip when working concentrically and flex the knee when working concentrically. But those same muscles can also extend the hip when working eccentrically. It could slow down hip extension through eccentric contraction. It could allow hip extension through eccentric contraction. And it could also prevent my hip from extending through isometric contraction. I don't have to see these motions. And one of the inverse problems with this is it makes your brain want to say, oh, if I see that motion, it must be these muscles. By memorizing a specific muscle with a specific motion, it's going to mess with your brain a second way by saying, if I see hip flexion, it's got to be hip flexors. But when you go down for a squat, you're not working your hip flexion pullers, you're working your hip extension pullers through eccentric contraction. Okay? So to help re-educate your brains to not want to associate specific muscles with specific motions, we're going to talk about muscle agonists, muscles responsible for doing a job, muscle that you're recruiting above resting tone. We're going to talk about them in their team name, their group names, not in their individual names, in their teams. And then in biomechanics, we'll talk about their individual names. How do we group muscles? Based off of their direction of pull. It could be the easiest thing or it could be the hardest thing. The easiest is because we have teams or groups of muscles in every direction of motion we have. So if you have the motion of shoulder flexion and extension, you are going to have muscles that pull in a direction of shoulder flexion pullers, we call them shoulder flexors. And you're going to have muscles that pull in the direction of shoulder extension. Shoulder extensors or shoulder extension pulling muscles. No skeletal muscle works by itself. This isn't the heart, this isn't the diaphragm. The bicep has buddies, it has partners, it has help. The tricep has help, the hamstrings have help. There are 7 major muscles, 8 if you count the little plantaris. That's not a very big player, but we only give credit to one muscle or a couple muscles when there's a lot more involved. Okay? So it's to understand that dorsiflexors are muscles that pull in the direction of dorsiflexion. When you're sleeping, when you're resting, when you're walking, all the time. Those dorsiflexion pullers can do dorsiflexion when they're working concentric. But those dorsiflexors can also work with no motion whatsoever if you're working them isometrically. Or they can work eccentrically when you heel strike and you transition from heel strike to foot flat. That's not your calf muscle plopping your foot down. Those are your dorsiflexion pullers, almost like pulling on the strings of your shoe, eccentrically allowing a controlled plantar flexion while you transition from heel strike to foot flat. So in that regard, you had dorsiflexors responsible for plantar flexion. That's okay through the context of eccentric contraction. You have as many muscle groups as you have allowable joint motions. For the ankle, we had plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. That means we're going to have dorsiflexion pullers and plantar flexion pullers. The dorsiflexion pullers are going to be in the front. Plantar flexion pullers are going to be in the back. That's like if you, and what's cool is both of them pull up. But if you take your heel and pull that up, it's going to want to make you plantar flex. And if you take your tongue and pull up, it's going to want to make you dorsiflex. Dorsiflexion puller and a plantar flexion puller. Who are those muscles? Who cares right now? Doesn't matter. In biomechanics, I'm going to teach you all the muscles. And teach you, but imagine how confusing me trying to teach you how muscles really work is if I threw out tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis longus, extensor digitorum, longus peroneus, tertius peroneus, longus peroneus brevis, tibialis posterior, flex hallucis longus, flexor digitorum, longus soleus, and gastroc. You lose sight of what's actually influencing motion, and that's these strings that we have that pull in different directions of motion. That is the most important thing. Guys, anybody can sit and memorize a bunch of words like I just did. But do you understand how muscles work? Okay? That is what my students will have above all others that are just playing fast and loose with memorizing specific muscles with specific motions. Why would this be important? For a lot of different reasons. One is, there may be cases in rehabilitation, athletic training, and therapy where there's certain muscles where you don't want to innervate. You want to give it a break while you work on some imbalanced stuff. And there's other cases where you want to specifically target or innervate certain muscles. So you can't just play fast and loose. Sometimes we want to do very specific contractions for exercises. And this isn't just rehab, this could be in my fitness people as well, where you just want to work on the concentric phase of a muscle working. Do you know how to set that up? Do you know how to make that work? There's some where you just want to do the eccentric component of a muscle contraction. Do you know how to make that work? Do you know how to set that up? to do all those things, we have to understand truly how muscles influence our motion. Stretching muscles, you have to understand how things that only pull are limited in their length tension. If something's trying to pull in a direction of book close, I'm going to stretch it by opening the book. All right? Any questions so far before I move on to my next analogy? Guys, this is the kind of stuff you're going to see. Well, some of the questions, let's do another example of what I'm trying to get you not to do. The triceps brachii is a large, thick muscle on the dorsal part of the upper arm. It often appears in the shape of a horseshoe on the posterior aspect of the arm. The primary function of the triceps is the extension of the elbow. Do you see the problem? Because if you don't, now's the time to talk. Do you see the problem with that last sentence? I'm not saying that last sentence is always wrong, but I am saying it's not always right. By memorizing tricep does extension, it's a problem for a number of ways. One is it makes your brain think, if I'm using my tricep, I'm only going to see extension. Another problem is, if I see extension, I'm only going to be using the tricep. Yes? No? Maybe so. Yes?
Sure. So the tricep, let's say your arm is in like a fully extended position, and then you start to flex.
Do you want me to pull up an exercise so that we can talk about it contextually? Only reason I'm asking so that everybody can see what we're talking about.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's like a little kickback thing? Is that cool?
Yeah, so let's say you're in like the end of the kickback, and you're going back.
I just want to make sure everybody can see what we're talking about. There I am.
So during like the eccentric part, is both your bicep and tricep working?
No.
So then what's happening?
Sure. So what's happening is your tricep is influencing the motion in both phases, but it's changing the motion by different contractions.
So for both of them, it's just the tricep?
Uh-huh.
So your bicep's not involved?
Because you don't need it.
Is it just gravity that's helping it, or?
Gravity is going against it.
Right.
Yeah. Gravity's playing tug of war against your elbow extensors, which your tricep is part of that team.
So this is the concentric, the eccentric, you're going like this. The tricep's still involved.
Gravity, it's like so think of it like this. Think of it as like, you ever seen one of those, you ever saw one of these static swimming pools that creates a current, right? So think of it like this. Gravity is the jet that's supplying the current that's trying to make that swimmer's body travel to our right. Okay? It's constantly there and it's outside of that person. The person, though, has to work to stay in that position, right? That's isometric. Like, you're doing a job to maintain your position. So if I was just going to hold it right here, that would be isometric. Okay. Now, what if the swimmer didn't want to stay in that position? What if the swimmer wanted to kind of back down a little bit? The swimmer would still be swimming in the same direction, but the swimmer would let the jet kind of take him back a little bit for a different picture. And then the swimmer says, you know what, I want to get closer to the current. I have to swim greater than the current So in all three scenarios, the swimmer was swimming in the exact same way, using the exact same muscles, but the motion changed, and that's why we have the term contraction. So in the case of this extensor exercise that works your tricep, gravity is trying to flex you. That's how I know I don't need my bicep. Because if I use my bicep, I yank it down. That's how I know she doesn't need her muscles that are doing this, because she would literally go with the current and fly back there, okay?
Right.
So you don't need your bicep because you can see why I don't need it, because of gravity in this case. Now, knowing that gravity is trying to flex you, and knowing that I need extensor pulling muscles, or muscles that are trying to extend me to go against it, then all I have to do, and this is the next part of the lecture on Friday that I'm going to put into there, how do we prove it? How do we see it? How do we say it? Muscles influence joint motion through contractions. And I'm going to show you this simple work equation. A plus B is equal to C. A stands for the agonistic muscles that we're working. B is going to be the joint motions that we observe. And if we don't observe any motion, that's no motion observed. And then C is going to be the contraction time. So in the case of this exercise, I know I need my extensors because gravity is trying to flex me. So my extensors, muscles that pull in the direction of extension, are actually going to do extension when they're working above resting tone through concentric contraction. So that's how I know this phase is concentric. When I do this, yeah, because I observe flexion. So the same muscles, my extensors, did the flexion, motion in the opposite direction, through eccentric contraction.
Right, and then it'll just be the opposite if you're doing like a bicep curl. When
One-
you're extending, it's going to be eccentric, and it's going to be your bicep group.
Yes, your elbow flexor group, right? Your elbow flexor group. But the reason we can definitively say, like if we were in kinesiology court and they were like, how do you know? And it's like, well, in this one, gravity's trying to flex me.
Right.
In this one, gravity's trying to extend me.
Yeah, extend. Okay.
So here, I don't need my flexors. Here, I don't need my extensors. If I use my extensors, I can literally throw the weights down and hurt myself. So I'm going to teach you how to prove or to see who you need because you understand why you need it. And then the contraction is actually going to be proven. Because once you know the agonistic group, then all you got to do is match up the motion and it's going to show you the contraction. Okay? For another example of this topic, gravity is trying to adduct my shoulders, right? So if I try to say, okay guys, let's see what groups of muscles I need. If gravity's trying to adduct me, I need muscles that are pulling in the direction of adduction to hold this position. Now if you say, well Campbell, why don't you just say the deltoids? And I'll be like, I could, but what about the other muscles? Like the supraspinatus muscle, or the long head of the biceps brachii. I mean, there's other muscles outside of the deltoid. So what's cool is, and what's comforting, in my opinion, this is what makes the group concept awesome, is that as long as you identify the group, there's an umbrella for all the different muscles that pull that way. Like you're covering all of them, whether it's 2 or 20. I know I need muscles that are pulling up to keep my arms from falling down. And the contraction is going to be proven once you identify the agonist and then you see what motion I observe. So in other words, I need abduction pullers, my abductors. But if I observe adduction, the only way the muscles that pull up can let me go down is through eccentric contraction. It's being lengthened while it's still trying to shorten. That is another weird concept. Muscles can shorten themselves, but muscles cannot lengthen themselves. I'll show you some examples of what I mean. Muscles can shorten themselves, but muscles cannot lengthen themselves. Exhibit A. Shorten. shorten, shorten. Lengthen. You could zap it with electricity. You could be the Emperor Palpatine, juicing it up. It won't matter. Something has to lengthen that TheraBand. Something outside of that TheraBand has to lengthen that TheraBand. Here is another analogy. And I'm going to use bicep and tricep for now because I know we know what that is, and I don't think we're comfortable using the group names, but I'm using elbow flexion pullers and elbow extension pullers, flexors and extensions. Okay? Let's see if I can do this. If I lay my elbow on the table, gravity is now null and void because the table is pushing back up on me. I'm relaxing everything. Nothing's trying to make my elbow do anything. So far, so good? The only way I can make my elbow extend from this position is to shorten the muscles that are pulling in the direction of elbow extension. My tricep has to make my elbow extend in this example. My bicep has to make my elbow flex. They can't push. So the point is that this can shorten and that can shorten. But something has to lengthen them. Meaning that as the tricep shortens, it is lengthening the bicep. And as the bicep shortens, it is lengthening the tricep. For the curl, as I go down, yes, my bicep is controlling how much it wants gravity to win, the tug of war, but gravity is lengthening my bicep. The bicep can't lengthen itself. How many of you have little brothers, sisters, cousins at home? Okay. The tug of war analogy that's in the book, I think, works really well. All right, so you're playing tug of war with your little brother, sister, cousin, and you know darn well you can yank them across the room and just like absolutely like rub it in their face, right? But you're not going to do that. Maybe you will. Mad respect. This is what you're going to do. You're going to pretend, especially if you want to get paid for your babysitting journeys. You're going to pretend I could totally roll this cart in my direction, but pretend the cart's trying to pull me the other way. Just not with a lot of force because it's a little kid. So I'm going to choose to not yank with all my force. I'm going to pretend. I'm going to be, oh, you got me. Right. And if I want the flag to go away from me, I just have to let off of my pull. I have to pull just a little bit less than what my little brother is pulling, and he will lengthen my muscles while my muscles are still trying to shorten. Guys, that's what happens when you take the pin and you put it on a weight, on the weight stack. You could hopefully beat that weight stack unless you're doing a max. And if you wanted to show that weight stack's who's boss, this is silly, but I love silly analogies because it helps prove a point. So I sit in the chest press machine and I put like 20 pounds on it, right? And I'm just like, I'm about to show you who's boss. And I'll be like, start, and I'll be like, I win! Uh-oh. Now what? My pride is not, I don't want to lose. So I'm just going to hold it here forever and ever and ever until I say, all right, weight stack, I'm going to let you win. The weight stack is lengthening my muscles while I'm still trying to shorten. I'm just choosing to try to shorten with a little less force than the weight stack is trying to lengthen. But it's the same muscles. I'm making it go away from me, and I'm letting it come back to me. But you know what I'm not doing it? making it go away from me and pulling it back to me. And that's what a lot of students feel is happening, because they're only looking at motion. They're only looking at, well, the muscles in the front do this, and the muscles in the back do that. Well, yeah, when you do it two separate exercises, muscles in the front do this, and muscles in the back do that when I'm rowing. Reason this is very passionate to me is because of one of my mentors, Coach Davis. He coached me in Delcom. He was at Kaplan and Abbeville High, and he died several years ago with a heart attack. Great guy, great guy. And he was proud of me when I finished up at Auburn and I came back here. And in fact, when I'd go play pickup ball with his teams, he'd be like, "Hey, this guy, call him the professor." You know, like the N1, they had like, you know, the little kid who was. So it was awesome. And one day, Coach and I were watching basketball. He'd invite me to his house. We'd watch basketball, talk sports and stuff. And he was like, "Brian," he's from Chicago. "Brian, let me ask you this. In my opinion, the greatest exercise in the upper body is the push-up." I was like, "Well, that's cool, Coach. What, you know, why do you say that?" He's like, "Because it works all your major muscle groups." Please go on. And now remember, guys, this is my man, like probably my best friend since probably 3 years after I graduated high school. His wife, or his widow, she runs Acadian Village for Lark. Okay, great people. He's like, "Because you work your chest when you come up, and you work your lats and your back when you go down. You work the front and you work the back." And I was like, "Coach, I don't know how to tell you this." And 45 minutes later, I got him to understand that you're working the same muscles when you go up and when you go down. And the biggest hurdle that I found with his misunderstanding, and so many misunderstandings from students previous and in the future, is that in his mind, his education was that when I see a certain motion, it has to be because of certain muscles. He's like, "But Brian, on the way down, you're doing a rowing motion." And I was like, "Coach, if you were using your lats, you'd pull your hands away from the ground and you'd smash your face in the ground. You don't need muscles that are trying to pull your hands back. You still need the ones that are trying to push your hands forward." So in his mind, he was seeing the row, like the bent over row, and he was seeing this motion. And he was trying to associate the same muscles with a specific motion. The biggest hurdle for you guys to get over, in my opinion. If you can get over that hurdle, that we do not associate specific muscles with specific motions, you're going to do a lot of great things. We cannot assume. Just because I see flexion doesn't mean I'm using upward pullers. Give me an example. See if I could find a before and after without the. They're gonna make me do this. So like something like this. And you're gonna hear, I've said it Monday, you're gonna hear me say it a lot of times. Same external force. So in other words, that machine is trying to flex his shoulders the whole time. True? If he relaxes, the machine's trying to flex. Now, the bar is pulling up, but it's through a pulley because gravity is trying to pull the weights down. That's why we have pulleys to redirect forces. No big deal. But the bar is trying to flex him. True? So if the bar is trying to flex him, he needs muscles that are trying to extend him. Extension pulling muscles. We're going to call them shoulder extensors. Who are those muscles? Who cares for now? You just know we have groups of muscles that pull in the direction of extension, and you see why you need them in this exercise. Well, Campbell, why don't you just say the lats? I could, but what about the other muscles? Like the teres major and the posterior deltoid. Right? There's other muscles there. So if all we ever do is just say one, then we lose track that there are others. So here's an example of what I'm trying to say. That when you observe flexion during this exercise, it's not because of the muscles that are pulling you up. It's still the muscles that are pulling you down, letting you go up. The bar is lengthening. Those muscles are being lengthened while they're still trying to shorten. I'm not saying they're trying to shorten at their max. They're letting the bar win. Just like you would let your little brother, sister, cousin win. You're letting the weight win. Because if you didn't, guys, think about it. Think about it. You get up to the bar, 20 pounds in my case, okay. Winning! Tying. How are you going to do another rep? You have to let off and let the bar be a little bit greater than you to allow it to lengthen your muscles so that you can shorten them again. This might be a little bit too heavy. Yoink. Make the book come up. Keep the book from falling down. Let the book go down. The book went down at the speed that I wanted it to go down because I was pulling up. I'll say that one more time. The book went down at the speed that I wanted it to go down because of the work that I was doing pulling up. Gravity can make the book fall like that. Sorry, Warmer. But if I want to control the speed, I'm still doing work. It's on me. I'm going to let my little brother, sister, cousin win the tug of war when I want them to win, on my terms. It's still you responsible for it. It's just you're letting the motion happen in the other direction of your pull. Okay? So what I'm trying to get you guys to see at this phase of the game is that just because I see shoulder flexion doesn't mean it's because of my anterior deltoid. In this case, it would actually be your posterior deltoid doing the flexion, and the same muscle doing the extension. For exercises, which is a majority of what we do in activities of daily living, the same external force, most of the time it's gravity, is going to produce innervation of the same agonist. And the variations in the motion that you're going to observe is because of variations in the contractions that those same muscles do. Same muscles going down and coming up. It's the same muscles. So how did the same thing be responsible for two different motions, two different contractions? Yes, ma'am?
You completely stopped contracting your muscles during an exercise and just let gravity pull everything up. Did you argue that gravity was the cause of that contraction?
You no longer had a
contraction if you just stopped.
You no longer had a contraction though.
Right. So then there's no longer a contraction. You just
Correct.
stopped.
Yep.
You ceased.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Because
So you're
contraction,
slowly-
correct. So remember, to be defined as a muscle contracting, doing a job, it's not just about lengthening or shortening.
Right.
It's about lengthening or shortening while it's being innervated above rest, while it's doing a job above rest. So if I just relax all my muscles, I'm gonna lengthen the extensors and shorten the flexors, but because they're off, they're not contracted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the gravity will be responsible for
Mhm.
the flexion,
Mhm.
but there's nothing.
No, your muscles don't need to do that. Yeah. It would almost be like if somebody was stretching you, and they were like, relax, 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 and they flexed you. They flexed you. Your muscles. Yeah, your muscles are like, relax, relax, relax. Good. Any other questions or clarifications? Guys, we were about to move on to application. I'm trying to lay the framework and the foundation of why we say things the way we say, why we do things the way we do, so that we can then play the game. Before you play any game, you got to learn the rules of the game. Here are the rules. Here's why we do it the way we do it. Now let's play. Okay? Good? All right, y'all have a good one.